Okay, so we talked about epithelial tissue. So another type of the four tissue types of the body is connective. And connective tissue has kind of some different functions. It generally is described as being tissue that connects one structure to another, like connects a muscle to a bone, or connects epithelium to something. But it also has a lot of kind of unusual tissues that stand alone, like cartilage. Cartilage itself is a connective tissue. So you can see that depicted here in this circle. And so we consider cartilage connective tissue, and it doesn't necessarily connect one thing to another. I mean, your ear is made up of cartilage, and the nasal septum is made up of cartilage, and bones do have cartilage at the end, so you could make arguments. But I think that that type of those type of cells and tissue is just very unique, and it's always going to be placed in connective tissue. Another tissue that's similar is bone. Bone is considered a connective tissue. Blood is considered a connective tissue. And then you have two types of connective tissue, three rather, that are very common and are sort of show up everywhere that I guess you see most often. So one would be loose connective tissue. So loose connective tissue pads organs, is wrapped around nerves, is underneath your skin. And that really is when people think of support and protection in the interface between epithelium and underlying structures. They think of loose connective tissue. And then the other really big category is something called fibrous connective tissue, which is made up of fibers that are packed together into structures like tendons and ligaments. So those structures are made of connective tissue, but they're made of fibrous connective tissue. And then adipose tissue within itself is connective tissue, and you can find adipose kind of sprinkled in with loose connective tissue in different places. And so anywhere you see a bunch of adipose cells, that's a good sign that you're in loose connective tissue. And so it's just a whole different tissue type that has some players in there that are so unique that they deserve their own discussion. So for example, when we do bone, we're going to talk about bone in more detail, and when we talk about, and cartilage as well, when we do the skeletal system. All right, so now epithelium was a tightly packed cells, so that sort of didn't have any extracellular matrix or ground substance, anything outside the cells we really had to worry about. But connective tissue does. So connective tissue has cells in it, some cells, not a whole lot, and the cells are not bound together in a big sheet. So these cells are kind of loose. They're not all held together like it's depicted here, very loose, very loose. And then there's substances between the cells that we call the extracellular matrix. And the matrix is made up of fibers. So you can see in this picture, this drawing, you see some cells. We'll talk about the cells, specialized cells. This is the adipocyte here. And then you see fibers between the cells, and then you just see pink stuff. The fibers can be three different types of fibers, and they're made up of some of these cells, the cells that make them. But then also the pink stuff is something called ground substance. Ground substance has proteoglycans and glycoproteins in it, and it's charged. So it's charged and polar so that it can hold on to water. So I don't really care so much that you know the names of the GAGs and the glycoproteins, but what I want you to understand is that ground substance is charged to hold water in it, so that the space between cells is like this gelatinous, watery glue that substrates like metabolites, waste products, metabolites and substrates that have to go to the cell. Everything that goes to cells and comes from cells have to pass through this gelatinous goo, essentially called ground substance in connective tissue. So connective tissue ends up being the battlefield for a lot of infections being fought, because a lot of these wandering cells are part of the immune system, but it also ends up being the field that things need to cross to make it to the epithelium and make it back to the bloodstream. And so it's sort of just a special space that has special fibers and special cells. And this is one of my colleagues who she does connective tissue very well, so she let me use her slides. This is one of her drawings that she made, and it has cells. Some of these cells are in the connective tissue permanently. They reside there, and then some of them are cells that we call wandering cells, so they come through and then they leave. We'll talk about them just generally. And then you can see fibers, and there are this orange pinkish fiber that's that you can see here that's larger. Those are collagen fibers. We talked about collagen a few times, and they're made up of protein. So these cells here, these fibroblasts, make those fibers. And then there's smaller fibers. These fibers, these little spindly black fibers, are called elastic fibers, and they have different qualities. So this is more information about the ground substance than you need to know, but I wanted to highlight that the important part is it binds lots of water, so it keeps the connective tissue full of water to be the substrate that everything has to be suspended in and pass through. And this is a good cartoon drawing and figure of what ground substance looks like at a close-up view. Most of this is lanyap. But the other reason why I didn't just erase this is that I wanted to highlight, remember those integral proteins that come through the cell membrane? Some of them adhere to the ground substance in the connective tissue, and I talked to you about that last time when I did epithelium, and I just wanted to highlight that is a reality, and that's why they're so important. Okay, but you don't have to know all the particulars about ground substance, all the different types and stuff. So we have some cells in connective tissue, and these cells are, they're famous. They have a job, and they do their job. We have a cell called a fibroblast. Fibroblasts make fibers. That's what they do. They secrete lots of proteins and make collagen fibers. We have adipocytes. Adipocytes are essentially fat cells. They store lipids in them so that they can be used as energy. They also play a role in the in metabolism and the endocrine system. Sorry, I'm having a brain lapse there. We have then some other cells that are integral for the immune system. Macrophages. Macrophages like this one here is going to gobble up debris and bacteria. We have mast cells that are depicted here that are going to make histamine, and very important for certain responses. Plasma cells that make antibodies, and other types of leukocytes that we'll just call them leukocytes, that are white blood cells with special roles. Leukocytes is like a general term. All right, so I gave you some information about each of these cells as if it was like a textbook, so that you can be familiar with what that cell's job is, a little bit about it, because I know that you all probably aren't reading the textbook. And so I'm trying to give you a little bit more of a resource. So the fibroblast is going to make the collagen and elastin fibers. And it also makes a lot of the ground substance that's there, okay? And it can look different depending on how active it is. It can be all stretched out between fibers, or it can, if it's very active, it can kind of be a little more plump here. And so you can see the fibroblast is actively secreting proteins, and the fibrocyte here is not. Okay, so you can tell their activity level. And then you can see fibers and adipocytes in between these cells that are making them. And this is one that's, what kind of, does anybody remember the name of the type of electron microscopy that makes this image? So this is a really close-up view of a fibroblast. You can see a lot of organelles in this cell because it's making a lot of proteins. Do you remember? So what if I gave you the choices? It's either A, transmission, or B, scanning. Which one do you think this one might be? are the electrons transmitting through the cell so it looks like a section, or is it bouncing off and look like a 3D picture? Kind of like a 3D picture? Yeah, I guess it kind of is, especially up here. So this here is a transmitting, so it's cut through, but actually up here, I forgot, I didn't see that. Maybe they have a little bit of both there. Okay, so the other kind of cell is an adipocyte. So I gave you, again, information. I tried to highlight a little bit about a function or something that they didn't really have a whole lot of function on here. You know, adipocyte fat is going to help cushion and protect organs. It also helps with thermoregulation. But it also plays a role in metabolism and the immune system. And this is what they look like in a regular histology slide, because all of the lipid gets washed out in that process that I talked to you about. All right, another cell is called a macrophage. So macrophages clean up debris, basically waste that's sort of can't be cleaned up in any other way, and it can gobble up bacteria. It can gobble up old red blood cells that are maybe stuck in a lung or such. So macrophages are very handy cells that are kind of hang around in lots of different places. And you might hear some of these specialized words in your training. Because a macrophage has a different name depending on where it is in the body. So if you might hear it called a Cooper cell if it's in the liver, or a Langerhans cell if it's in the skin. But they're all macrophages. They all come from the same place. And then another kind of cell is called a mast cell. So a mast cell is going to be responsible for inflammatory responses in the body. And also it is, when I think of mast cells, I think oftentimes of histamine. So it releases a lot of histamine to open up the vascular system. And it can play a role in anaphylactic shock. So mast cells can play a role and release a whole bunch of histamine at one time, which can sometimes cause a problem if you're allergic to something, like you're allergic to shellfish or bee sting. What happens is that the mast cells release all of their granules at once, and you can have anaphylaxis. So another cell that's very common in connective tissue is called a plasma cell. So plasma cell, I've shown you one of these before actually. They make antibodies. And so here you can see they have a really cool clock face appearance when you're looking at them in histology. They're kind of hard to find when you're just starting out. You're not going to make you identify a plasma cell or a mast cell. But a plasma cell makes antibodies. So what that means is when you have something, an exposure to something that your body deems foreign and wants to protect yourself from, your body makes antibodies. So these plasma cells will make a whole bunch of markers that will float around your bloodstream and just forever. They'll just sit there floating around. The plasma cells will keep making them. And then what happens is that the next time you're exposed to that agent, then it will float around your bloodstream, and one of those antibodies will attach itself to whatever the invading microbe is. And so your immune system sees these antibodies as flags to come after whatever it is and destroy it. So antibodies are a way that your body protects itself and has like long-term memory of having certain diseases and being exposed to certain antigens. Okay? It's a really, really complex and cool system, but on the simplistic level, that's pretty much what's happening. And then you have different types of leukocytes. Leukocytes are just white blood cells. You don't have to know them for me. You're going to probably study white blood cells when you do the blood system and if you take the second part of this course. But I want you to know that they are considered part of connective tissue because blood is considered part of connective tissue. So if you were to have a question about what tissue does a white blood cell belong to, I would hope that you would be able to remember that blood is part of connective. And I highlighted, you know, that basically what the white blood cells do is they protect the body from foreign invaders and infections, and also some chemical substances. Okay, so that's the specialized cells in connective tissue. We talked a little bit about the different types. I'll bring that up again. So what about the fibers? There are 3 different types of fibers. One is called collagen, most prevalent type of fiber. One is called a reticular fiber, which actually is one type of collagen, but they're much bigger, and they're only in certain places of the body, so we give the reticular fibers their own category. And the other type of fiber is called elastic fibers, and they're not made of collagen, they're made of elastin, and they have completely different properties. So there's only 3 fibers. So collagen is made up of proteins, and these proteins link into these really long units. It's the most abundant protein in the body, and you can see that they are going to stain very acidophilic. And so what you're looking at are some fibroblasts here. So we have some active fibroblasts and some fibrocytes that are not active, and then we have collagen fibers that are between the fibroblasts. And there are 28 different kinds of collagen. You don't have to know which ones are which for me, but except for maybe reticular fibers. And I'm going to do those now. And so another kind of particular type of collagen, type 1 is the most prevalent in the body. Most of the collagen you'll look at as a slide will be type 1. And then type 2 is actually in cartilage. It's pretty cool, so that's the collagen there. Now type 3 has a special name, and we're going to call these fibers reticular fibers. They're much larger than type 1 collagen fibers. And you see that they have a special stain. We can stain them, and they kind of show up more black stained, a dark brown or black color, and collagen usually stains pink. And reticular fibers are special because they actually make up some glandular organs and some other organs that so that the cells of those organs can be suspended in a big network. It's really a cool configuration. And so you see a couple examples here. Here's a lymph node. The reticular fibers are suspending the cells in this lymph node so that blood can lymph can filter through this node, and it has contact with all of these cells, so the cells can like very closely police what flows through that lymph node, which is what you want your immune system to do. And then this is a gland here. It's an adrenal gland, and the reticular fibers are suspending all of these cells that are making products so that the products can be absorbed into the bloodstream and go to their final destinations. All right, and then elastic fibers. Elastic fibers are much smaller than collagen fibers. They're much thinner. Here you can see some little thin elastic fibers, and then the deep pink, thicker ones are actually collagen. So you can see the contrast in this beautiful smear. And elastic fibers are shown here. There's a whole bunch of them sandwiched together in the aorta, an elastic artery. So elastic fibers are probably the opposite of what you think that if you think of something being elastic, you probably think of it being stretched out, right? You think of that? If something is elastic, you think of spandex or something being elastic, that you can stretch it. But really the terminology for what is elastic, it's not that you stretch it out, it's that it returns back to its original shape. So the fact that the elastic fiber can stretch and then return is a unique quality that only that kind of fiber has. The other fibers, collagen and reticular fibers, are not going, you can stretch them and then they're just going to break. They're not going to return back, recoil back into the original shape. So that's what makes elastic fibers cool. Unfortunately, usually in a regular slide, elastic fibers and collagen fibers look like the same color. So you really need a special stain to see them very well. Okay, so that's all of these cells, that's all of the fibers, and now we want the classification like we did for epithelium. You have loose connective tissue where you have space between fibers, is relatively, has adipose tissue maybe in there and specialized cells and structures. And then you have dense, irregular connective tissue, so you have tissue that has a lot of fibers, but it does not have super highly organized fibers. Dense regular has very organized fibers that are closely knit together. Then you can have reticular tissue, which is those organs I showed you before that are made up of reticular fibers, and adipose tissue specifically. These other types of connective tissue, bone, cartilage, blood, and mucoid, which is just in the umbilical cord, we're going to talk about those later. Okay, so we're not going to talk about those special connective tissues today. So reticular tissue, like I showed you, is going to be certain organs where the special cells need to be suspended to do their job. So the liver is one, a lymph node is another one, and it's going to have this meshwork of fibers that are suspending specialized cells. Loose or areolar connective tissue is going to have cells in it and some fibers, but it's also going to have a lot of other spaces. It usually has a lot of blood vessels in it and some patches of adipose tissue in there. And so it usually is wrapped around organs, glands, underneath epithelium. Usually loose connective tissue is found to be a very prominent supporting tissue that is directly associated with epithelium and organs. And then you have dense irregular tissue like this. See, there's a lot of fibers here. These fibers are packed together. There's less cells than loose areolar tissue, but the fibers are not super organized. If you have to decide and think about, I wonder if this is regular or irregular, it's probably irregular. Because usually when you get to a regular connective tissue, you're not wondering whether it's regular or not because it looks so nice and organized. So I think dense irregular is kind of the hardest for people to let their anxiety go and just trust their instincts that these fibers do not look super organized. I know they're dense, but they're not super organized. Now this is an example of dense regular where you have it super organized. And I hope that you can see the marked difference between the organization in this dense connective tissue and the one that was back here. Although they have a lot of deep, dark pink collagen fibers packed in there, the organization makes one irregular and the other regular. So dense irregular might be in the dermis of the skin and on certain places of the digestive tract that you might see some dense irregular. But dense regular very specifically is going to be in certain places that have a lot of stress, like a tendon or a ligament or an aponeurosis, which attaches muscles to bone. So there are much fewer cases in the body of dense regular connective tissue than there would be of any of the other kinds of connective tissue. And then adipose tissue could really be so many different places in the skin, around organs, in the breast, and it can just be sort of packed around muscle on the outside of nerves. You can see little patches of adipose tissue that look like empty cells, essentially. This is what it looks like. The cells are empty as if they have nothing inside of them. This is an adipose stain. And that's how they appear. Okay. Oh, and then cartilage. We're going to talk about cartilage in more depth because your textbook has the 3 different kinds of cartilage, and I want to give it its due course when we do the skeletal system. But I just wanted to bring it up that cartilage and bone, we will discuss it, and it has specialized cells in it that are different from the ones we talked about, and it also has collagen in there and ground substance as well. So it's the same components, they're just slightly specialized. Okay, so I also have a lab for connective tissue where it has structures that you can find, and it has slides that you can click on, and it doesn't, I mean, you can look at stuff and ask me questions since I'm here. It also has explanation slides, but if you also want to do this at home, which I think, it's fun when you can really test your knowledge, because when we come in next class, I'll have a little quiz that will just ask you some basic structures and allow you to apply your knowledge from this session. So go ahead and you can look at and see if you want to ask me anything in person.